The night everything shifted. I had learned over the years how to disappear in public places. It came with the job. 23 years as a private investigator in Des Moines taught me how to sit still, blend in, and watch without being noticed. People always assumed invisibility arrived with age. They were wrong. Invisibility was a skill, one I'd mastered long before my hair turned silver at the temples. That night I sat in my usual corner at Catalyst Jazz Club, a half-empty glass of bourbon resting beneath my fingers like an anchor. The club was dim, warm, and familiar, low amber lights, worn wooden tables, and the soft haze of smoke that clung to the air despite all the modern regulations meant to erase it. Jazz refused to be clean. That was part of why I loved it. The saxophone cried gently from the stage, its notes slow and aching, as if it understood exactly how tired I was. I was 55 years old, divorced twice, childless by choice and consequence, and emotionally exhausted in a way sleep never fixed. That afternoon I'd closed another case, yet another spouse caught lying, cheating, apologizing too late. The details blurred together after a while. The lies were always creative, the truth never. I took a slow sip of bourbon and let the burn remind me I was still present. Catalyst had become my quiet ritual over the past year. Same seat, same drink, same nights, usually Thursdays, sometimes Fridays. I told myself it was about the music, but that wasn't entirely honest. It was about being somewhere I didn't have to explain myself. No expectations, no small talk, just sound and shadows and the comforting anonymity of strangers. The quartet shifted into a deeper groove, the bass pulsing low as the trumpet joined in. Conversations softened around the room. People leaned closer to each other, drawn inward by the music's gravity. That was when the door opened. A rush of cool October air swept across the room, brushing my ankles. I didn't look up immediately. Old habits die hard. But something made me glance toward the entrance anyway, a subtle shift in energy, like the room had inhaled. She stood just inside the doorway, pausing as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Blonde, early 30s maybe, tall but not imposing. She wore a charcoal coat over a cream blouse, simple but elegant, the kind of outfit that suggested intention rather than effort. She wasn't scanning the room aimlessly. She was searching. Her posture caught my attention first, straight-backed, composed, as though she'd learned early how to command space without demanding it. Academic, I thought immediately. A professor or a researcher. Someone used to thinking deeply and speaking carefully. She removed her coat and handed it to the hostess with a polite smile that looked practiced but genuine. When she turned, her eyes, bright, clear blue, swept across the room. And then they found me. The moment our gazes met, something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't attraction in the way I'd known it before. Not sharp, not hungry. This was slower, heavier, like recognition without memory. Her expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker, curiosity maybe, or surprise. Neither of us looked away. The music swelled, the trumpet weaving around the saxophone in a way that made my breath hitch. I became acutely aware of my surroundings, the weight of the glass in my hand, the faint scent of citrus cleaner on the table, the low murmur of conversation around us. Then she blinked and turned toward the bar. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. "You good?" the waitress asked softly as she passed, nodding toward my glass. "Another," I said, "double." She smiled knowingly and moved on. I told myself not to stare, told myself it was nothing, a stranger in a jazz club. It happened all the time. But when the blonde woman took a seat near the stage, close enough to feel the vibration of the bass, I found my attention drifting back to her again and again. She ordered wine. Red, she cradled the glass loosely, fingers tapping against the stem in time with the rhythm. She didn't check her phone, didn't look bored. She listened, really listened, with her head tilted slightly as though absorbing every note. That more than anything else drew me in. People rarely listened anymore. The band launched into their signature piece, a slow, emotional number that always hushed the room. Even the bartender paused his movements. The music carried weight, loss, longing, hope tangled together. The blonde woman turned again. This time when our eyes met, she smiled. Not wide, not flirtatious, just enough to acknowledge the connection. She lifted her glass slightly, a quiet toast across the room. Without thinking, I raised my bourbon in response. The gesture felt intimate, intentional. Dangerous. I took another sip, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I had no business feeling this way over a stranger. Not after everything I'd seen, not at my age. Attraction was supposed to dull with time, wasn't it? Apparently, no one had told my nervous system. When the set ended, applause filled the club. The band took a short break, musicians stepping off stage to towel their faces and sip water. Conversations picked up again, louder now. I expected her to leave. People usually did after the first set. She didn't. She stayed, ordering another glass of wine, crossing one leg over the other with an ease that suggested confidence rather than display. Occasionally, she glanced in my direction, not constantly, not obviously, but enough that I noticed. By the time I left an hour later, my thoughts were tangled. Outside, the night was crisp. Leaves skittered along the sidewalk as I buttoned my coat and walked toward my car. I half expected her to appear beside me, to say something clever or unexpected. She didn't. The drive home was quiet, too quiet. I slept poorly, my dreams filled with music and blue eyes, and the sense that something unfinished lingered just out of reach. 3 days later, my phone rang with the kind of call that pulled me back into myself immediately. Alexandra Bailey, I answered, already reaching for my notebook. Miss Bailey, a man said, his voice tight with nerves. My name is Harrison Reed. I was given your name by a mutual acquaintance. I believe I've been robbed. An hour later, he sat across from my desk, hands twisting together in his lap. Harrison Reed was exactly what I'd expected, a wealthy collector with too much money and not enough peace. He wore an expensive suit that didn't quite hide his anxiety. His eyes darted around my office as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. They didn't take everything, he said, just specific pieces. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Which pieces? He slid a folder across my desk. Inside were photographs of ancient artifacts, Greek by the look of them. They're not the most valuable, he continued. That's what confuses me, but they share a common theme. I picked up the photographs one by one. A bronze mirror, its surface darkened with age. A painted vessel depicting two women standing close together. A fragment of marble sculpture, worn but unmistakably intimate. Transformation, Reed said quietly. Forbidden love, stories that weren't meant to survive. I felt a flicker of interest. You think the thief knew that? I'm certain of it. When he left, my office felt heavier than before. I stared at the photos spread across my desk. This wasn't a smash and grab, it was deliberate, personal. I needed expertise. My contact at the university answered on the second ring. I'm looking for someone who specializes in Greek mythology, I said, specifically lesser-known narratives. There was a pause, then, you want Dr. Jasmine Wright. The name landed like a dropped glass. Jasmine Wright, I repeated. Yes, brilliant researcher, early 30s, focuses on marginalized narratives in ancient cultures. Why? I swallowed, send her my way. 2 hours later, my office door opened. She stood there, just as composed as she'd been at the jazz club. Cream blouse, dark slacks, hair pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck, and those blue eyes, alert, curious, familiar. Miss Bailey, she said, smiling slightly. I believe we've already met, or at least noticed each other. I stood slowly, my heartbeat suddenly very loud. Yes, I said, Catalyst Jazz Club. Her smile warmed. I thought so. She sat across from me, crossing her legs with that same effortless confidence. When I slid the photographs toward her, her demeanor shifted, focused, intent. These are important, she said after a moment. Not because of their monetary value, but because of what they represent. And what's that? I asked. She met my gaze. Women's stories, love that existed even when society tried to erase it. The words settled between us, heavy and meaningful. I watched her fingers trace the edges of the photographs, reverent, almost protective. This wasn't just academic for her, it was personal. I'd like you to consult on this case, I said. Her eyes brightened. I'd like that. When she stood to leave, she paused near my desk, closer than necessary. Our hands brushed as she reached for her bag, and a jolt of awareness shot through me. Same time tomorrow? I asked. She nodded, and Alexandra. Yes. That quartet is playing again Friday night. Her smile lingered as she left. I sat alone in my office long after the door closed, aware, deeply aware, that something had begun. Not a case. The consultant with a mind like fire. The next morning arrived with a quiet insistence, the kind that didn't rush but refused to be ignored. Sunlight filtered through the blinds of my office, catching dust motes in its path and illuminating the photographs still spread across my desk from the night before. I hadn't bothered to file them away. Something told me this case deserved to breathe. Or maybe I needed the reminder that the connection I'd felt with Jasmine Wright hadn't been imagined, hadn't been the product of bourbon and loneliness. It had followed me home, settled into my thoughts, and refused to loosen its grip. By the time Jasmine arrived, precisely on time, I was already 2 cups of coffee in and pretending to review notes I'd memorized hours earlier. She stepped inside with the same composed confidence, though today she wore a navy blazer over a soft gray top, her hair down and brushing her shoulders. The look was professional, but there was an ease to her presence now, as if the barrier between stranger and collaborator had already thinned. She greeted me with a warm nod rather than a handshake, and I noticed the way her eyes briefly swept the room again, taking in details most people missed. It was the look of someone who analyzed the world not for advantage, but for understanding. We spent the morning immersed in the artifacts. Jasmine spoke with a clarity that was both precise and passionate, weaving historical context into living narrative. She explained how stories of women loving women had been embedded into mythology, often disguised as metaphors of transformation or divine punishment, preserved in fragments because they were never meant to be celebrated openly. Listening to her, I found myself less focused on the theft and more on the weight of what had been taken. These weren't objects, they were voices. What struck me most wasn't just her intelligence, though that was undeniable. It was the care with which she spoke, the way her voice softened when discussing erased histories, as though she carried a personal responsibility to protect them. She wasn't performing expertise, she was living it. As the hours passed, our professional rhythm settled into something unexpectedly natural. We challenged each other's assumptions, filled gaps in logic, and shared quiet moments of understanding without the need for explanation. Occasionally, our eyes would meet over the table, and there would be a pause, brief, unspoken, charged, but neither of us acknowledged it directly. Not yet. Around mid-afternoon, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, folding her hands thoughtfully. She suggested that the thefts weren't just about possession, but about control of narrative. If someone could own these artifacts, they could decide how, or if, the stories attached to them were told. It was a theory that reframed everything, shifting the case from crime to ideology. I realized then that hiring her hadn't just strengthened the investigation. It had changed it, and perhaps, in ways I wasn't ready to examine, it was changing me too. When she left that day, promising to review her academic contacts for any unusual inquiries or funding patterns, the office felt emptier than it had any right to. I told myself it was because the case had grown more complex, but I knew better. Over the next several days, Jasmine became a regular presence in my life. We met in my office, at the university, and occasionally at a quiet cafe halfway between our worlds. Each meeting peeled back another layer of familiarity. She spoke about her work with a fierce commitment that reminded me why I'd become an investigator in the first place. I shared stories from my career, cases that had haunted me, moments where justice had felt incomplete. Somewhere between theory and experience, something mutual began to form. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't reckless, it was deliberate. Friday night arrived before I realized I'd been counting down to it. Catalyst Jazz Club looked the same as always, but it felt different stepping inside with anticipation instead of resignation. Jasmine was already there, seated near the stage as before, a glass of wine waiting. When she looked up and saw me, her smile was immediate, unguarded. We talked between sets, not just about the case, but about life. She told me about her first trip to Greece, how standing among ruins had made her feel both insignificant and powerful at the same time. I told her about my early years as an investigator, the mistakes I'd made trying to prove myself in a profession that didn't expect women to last long. There was laughter, shared silence, and the music threading through it all like a steady heartbeat. At one point, she turned to me, her expression thoughtful, and said that working with me felt different from anything she'd expected. That I listened in a way that made her feel seen, not evaluated. The honesty of the comment caught me off guard. I admitted that she had a way of reigniting curiosity in me, of reminding me that learning didn't stop just because you'd lived a long time. When we parted that night, standing beneath the streetlight outside the club, neither of us rushed to say goodbye. The moment stretched, fragile and meaningful. There was no touch, no promise, but the air between us felt full of possibility. As I drove home, I understood something with startling clarity. This partnership, professional, intellectual, emotional, was no longer just about solving a case. It was about confronting the parts of ourselves we'd kept carefully contained. Jasmine wasn't just consulting on stolen artifacts. She was quietly challenging the narratives I'd accepted about age, desire, and the limits of my own future. Secrets hidden in history. The deeper we moved into the case, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary theft, and the weight of that realization settled into my days with an unfamiliar intensity. My office, once a place of routine and repetition, transformed into a living map of questions, theories, and half-formed connections. Photographs of the stolen artifacts shared wall space with timelines, notes, and names that kept multiplying the more we searched. Jasmine spent long hours there with me, often arriving with fresh research or quiet insights that reshaped the direction of our investigation. The professional line between us remained intact, but it grew thinner with every conversation, stretched by mutual respect and a growing awareness that we trusted each other more than we were admitting out loud. Jasmine's approach to history fascinated me. She didn't treat the past as something distant or sealed away. To her, it was alive, breathing through objects, texts, and silences. She explained that many ancient Greek stories about transformation, women turning into birds, trees, or constellations, were not merely poetic fantasies, but coded narratives about love that society could not openly accept. The stolen artifacts, she believed, were part of a larger pattern, one that celebrated female connection and agency in a world that had long tried to bury both. Listening to her speak, I began to understand that the crime wasn't just about acquiring rare objects. It was about owning a version of history that challenged modern power structures. As days turned into a week, Jasmine uncovered something troubling. Several recent academic grants tied to mythology research had been quietly redirected, their funding sources obscured behind layers of shell organizations. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate, but the deeper she looked, the more inconsistencies surfaced. The patterns suggested coordination, not coincidence. Someone was financing access to scholars, collections, and private archives, selectively targeting knowledge as much as artifacts. That realization sent a chill through me. I had dealt with organized crime before, but this felt different. It was quieter, more patient, and infinitely more dangerous. One evening, while we reviewed documents spread across her apartment dining table, Jasmine grew unusually quiet. The room was softly lit, shelves of books casting long shadows against the walls, and the atmosphere felt heavier than before. When I asked what was wrong, she hesitated, then admitted that one of the names tied to the funding irregularities belonged to a graduate student in her department, someone she'd mentored briefly in the past. The personal connection rattled her, and I could see the conflict playing across her face. Professional responsibility clashing with the instinct to protect her academic community. I reminded her gently that uncovering the truth didn't make her responsible for someone else's choices. Still, I understood her unease. This case had crossed into her world now, threatening the careful balance she'd built between passion and professionalism. That night, as we worked late into the silence, our conversation drifted beyond the investigation. We spoke about fear, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet fear of losing what you'd worked so hard to build. Jasmine admitted that academia often demanded emotional restraint, that being openly passionate about marginalized histories sometimes came with consequences. I shared my own experience of emotional distance, how years of witnessing betrayal had made it easier to observe than to engage. In those moments, sitting side by side surrounded by books and unanswered questions, something shifted again. There was no dramatic gesture, no declaration, but a sense of mutual understanding settled between us, steady and grounding. We were two women at different stages of life, shaped by different pressures, yet bound by a shared refusal to let truth be silenced. That connection felt stronger than attraction, deeper than curiosity. It felt purposeful. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly. A routine background check revealed that one of the shell companies financing the grants had ties to an international art brokerage known for dealing in unclassified antiquities. The company specialized in objects that challenged traditional narratives, pieces that were often withheld from public display or academic discourse. The implication was clear. Someone was attempting to control not just ownership, but interpretation, deciding which stories deserve to be told and which should remain hidden. When I shared this with Jasmine, her reaction was immediate and resolute. She spoke about responsibility, about the danger of allowing history to be curated by those with money rather than integrity. I watched her as she spoke, recognizing a quiet bravery that went beyond scholarship. This wasn't abstract for her. It was personal, ethical, and deeply rooted in her sense of self. In that moment, I realized she wasn't just helping me solve a case. She was standing at a crossroads of her own, one that demanded courage regardless of the cost. As the investigation intensified, so did the stakes. I began taking additional precautions, varying my routes, checking surroundings with renewed vigilance. Jasmine noticed, of course. She always did. When she confronted me about it, I didn't sugarcoat the truth. I told her that people who trafficked in silence and control rarely stopped at theft. Knowledge, especially the kind that threatened established power, made people vulnerable. The concern in her eyes wasn't fear for herself alone, but for the work she believed in. Still, she didn't back away. If anything, her resolve hardened. By the end of that week, the case had transformed into something far larger than I'd anticipated, and so had the connection between us. We were no longer just investigator and consultant. We were allies, bound by shared purpose and an unspoken understanding that neither of us could walk away now without losing something essential. History, I had learned from Jasmine, was shaped by those willing to protect it. And as I looked at her across the table that night, surrounded by fragments of the past, I knew this story, ours and the one we were uncovering, was only beginning to reveal its true cost. When walls begin to fall. By the time the case reached its fourth week, it had settled into every corner of my life, not as an intrusion, but as a presence I had quietly accepted. My routines changed without conscious decision. I woke earlier, slept lighter, and found myself thinking several moves ahead not only for the investigation, but for Jasmine's safety. That realization unsettled me more than the threats implied by shell companies and hidden brokers. I had spent years maintaining emotional distance as a form of self-preservation, yet somewhere along the way, concern had slipped past my defenses and taken root. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was steady, almost gentle, and that made it far more powerful. Jasmine noticed the change before I did. She always noticed things like that. One evening, as we sat in my office reviewing a fresh set of documents, she paused mid-sentence and studied me with a seriousness that made me set my pen down. She asked quietly but directly whether I was carrying more than I let on. I gave her a practiced half-smile, the kind I'd used for years to deflect concern, but it didn't work on her. She wasn't looking for reassurance. She was looking for honesty. That alone told me how deeply our dynamic had shifted. I told her the truth, or at least the part of it I could articulate. I explained that the case was moving into territory where knowledge itself became a liability, and that I had seen enough to know how far certain people were willing to go to maintain control. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The facts were heavy enough on their own. As I spoke, I watched her expression change, not to fear, but to something more complicated. Resolve mixed with sadness, as though she had always known that standing for truth came with a cost, but hearing it aloud made that cost real. She didn't suggest stepping away. She didn't ask me to protect her by excluding her. Instead, she spoke about responsibility and choice, about how every meaningful contribution required risk, even if the risk was unevenly distributed. Her words carried conviction, but there was vulnerability beneath them. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw uncertainty flicker through her confidence. Not doubt in her beliefs, but fear of losing the life she had built if she pushed too hard against forces larger than herself. That conversation marked a turning point. From then on, our collaboration became something more intimate, not in gesture, but in trust. We began sharing thoughts that drifted beyond the case, memories, regrets, the quiet questions that surfaced late at night when ambition gave way to reflection. I told her about the early years of my career, how I'd hardened myself to survive in a profession that rewarded detachment. She listened without interrupting, her attention steady and unflinching. When I admitted that I sometimes wondered who I might have been if I'd allowed myself more softness, she reached across the table and rested her hand near mine, not touching, but close enough to be felt. Jasmine spoke about her own journey, about navigating academic spaces that valued her intellect, but often resisted the implications of her work. She described the exhaustion of constantly justifying why marginalized histories mattered, a feeling both visible and invisible at the same time. As she spoke, I realized how similar our paths were despite the years between us. We had both learned to stand firm, to succeed by refusing to bend. And in doing so, we had both learned to keep parts of ourselves guarded. The night stretched on, the city outside my office quiet and distant. At some point, the case files were forgotten, pushed aside by the weight of the moment. We sat facing each other, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable but charged with things unsaid. I felt the familiar urge to retreat, to reassert boundaries before they dissolved completely. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was the way she looked at me, not with expectation, but with openness. Or perhaps it was the realization that walls built for protection could also become prisons. When she finally stood to leave, the moment felt fragile, as though one wrong word could undo everything we'd shared. She hesitated near the door, turning back to me with a seriousness that mirrored my own thoughts. She said that working with me had changed her understanding of partnership, that she had never felt so intellectually challenged and personally supported at the same time. The words landed softly, but their impact was profound. I replied honestly, telling her that she had reminded me why curiosity and courage mattered, not just in work but in life. After she left, I remained in my office long after the lights of neighboring buildings went dark. I thought about the path ahead, about the investigation tightening like a knot, and about the undeniable truth that my emotional distance was no longer intact. Whatever this connection was, it wasn't reckless or impulsive. It was deliberate, earned through shared purpose and mutual respect. That realization frightened me more than any threat the case presented, because it meant I had something to lose. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified. Leads pointed toward larger networks, and subtle signs suggested we were being watched. I increased security measures, careful not to alarm Jasmine while refusing to underestimate the danger. She, in turn, became more focused, channeling her energy into research with a quiet determination that bordered on defiance. Watching her, I understood that this was who she was at her core. Someone who confronted erasure by insisting on presence, who met resistance with clarity rather than force. The cost of standing firm. First sign that the case had crossed an invisible boundary came quietly, almost politely, which somehow made it more unsettling. One morning, as I unlocked my office door, I noticed the faint impression of a shoe print near the threshold, just off to the side where most people wouldn't look. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream forced entry or threat. It suggested presence. Someone had been there long enough to linger, to observe, to remind me, subtly, that we were no longer working unnoticed. I erased the mark before Jasmine arrived, not out of denial, but because I needed time to decide how much truth to share and when. As the day unfolded, the investigation continued to yield information that confirmed my unease. Financial records connected the shell companies Jasmine had uncovered to a network operating far beyond state lines, one that specialized in moving controversial artifacts into private collections where public scrutiny couldn't reach them. These weren't impulsive criminals. They were methodical, patient, and deeply invested in controlling which stories survived and which remained buried. The realization reframed everything. This was no longer just about recovering stolen items. It was about confronting a system that thrived on silence and selective memory. Jasmine arrived mid-morning, carrying a folder thicker than usual, her expression focused but calm. As we reviewed her findings, I noticed the subtle tension beneath her composure. She, too, sensed the shift, even if she hadn't yet seen the signs I had. Her research revealed that several scholars who had attempted to publish work similar to hers had faced sudden career setbacks. Grants withdrawn, reputations quietly questioned, opportunities disappearing without explanation. None of it was provable in isolation. Together, it formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. When I finally told her about the shoe print, about my growing concern that we were being monitored, she didn't react with fear. Instead, she grew very still, absorbing the information with the seriousness it deserved. She asked measured questions, not about her own safety, but about the integrity of the investigation. Would this change how we proceeded? Would it affect our ability to bring the truth into the open? Her priorities were clear, and they both impressed and worried me. That evening, we decided to move our work to a more controlled environment, rotating locations and limiting digital communication. It was a precaution born of experience, and Jasmine accepted it without argument. Still, the tension followed us, settling into the spaces between words and glances. As we worked late into the night at my apartment, surrounded by documents and the quiet hum of the city outside, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on both of us. This was no longer an abstract ethical debate. Real consequences loomed, and they would not be evenly shared. At one point, Jasmine set aside her notes and looked at me with an intensity that stopped me mid-thought. She asked whether I regretted taking the case, whether bringing her into it had complicated my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. The question wasn't accusatory. It was searching, honest. I considered my answer carefully, aware that this moment mattered more than any strategic decision we'd made so far. I told her the truth, that the case had indeed become more dangerous, more personal, but that regret was not the word I would use. I explained that some truths demanded witnesses, and some partnerships once formed couldn't be undone without cost. She listened, her gaze steady, then shared something she'd rarely spoken aloud. She admitted that part of her had always known her work would invite resistance, that choosing to study erased histories meant accepting a certain level of risk. What she hadn't expected was to find herself caring so deeply about the person standing beside her in that fight. The admission hung between us, heavy and unguarded. There was no drama in it, no attempt to soften the impact. It was simply true. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified. Anonymous emails arrived, vague enough to deny intent, specific enough to unsettle. A source who had agreed to meet suddenly withdrew without explanation. Each development reinforced the same message. Someone wanted this investigation to stop. I responded the only way I knew how, by pushing forward with greater precision and caution. Jasmine, rather than retreating, became more focused than ever, refining her arguments, preparing documentation that could withstand scrutiny from any institution willing to listen. What struck me most during that time was her resilience. She didn't romanticize the struggle or underestimate the danger, but neither did she allow it to define her. She moved through the tension with quiet determination, grounded by a sense of purpose that went beyond personal ambition. Watching her, I felt a mix of admiration and protectiveness that I struggled to reconcile. I wanted to shield her from harm, yet I respected her too much to deny her agency. One night after a particularly long day, we sat in silence, the case files untouched between us. The city lights outside cast soft reflections across the room, and for a moment the world felt suspended. Jasmine spoke first, saying that whatever happened next, she didn't want fear to dictate her choices. She believed that standing firm, even quietly, was itself a form of resistance. Her words resonated deeply, echoing a philosophy I had lived by without naming it. As I looked at her then, I understood the true cost of standing for something that mattered. It wasn't just the external threats or professional risks. It was the vulnerability of caring, of allowing another person's well-being to matter as much as your own. The case had demanded that I confront powerful adversaries, but it was this connection, this shared resolve, that required the greatest courage. And despite the uncertainty ahead, I knew I would not choose differently. The weight of truth. By the time the investigation entered its sixth phase, the tension had become a constant companion rather than an interruption. It followed us into every room, every conversation, every moment of quiet reflection. I had learned to recognize its presence the way one learns to live with chronic pain, not always sharp, but always there, shaping movement and thought. Jasmine felt it too, though she carried it differently, internalizing the pressure and transforming it into an even sharper focus. Where I became more cautious, she became more deliberate, as if precision itself were a form of defiance. The breakthrough came not with spectacle, but with patience. A series of minor discrepancies in shipping records, details most people would have dismissed as clerical errors, aligned perfectly with the timelines of the stolen artifacts. Cross-referenced with Jasmine's research, the pattern revealed a hidden corridor between academic institutions, private collectors, and offshore intermediaries. It was a system designed to appear fragmented, each piece plausible on its own, but together forming a deliberate mechanism for extraction and concealment. The truth, once visible, was impossible to ignore. As we assembled the evidence, I became increasingly aware that the information we held was more dangerous than any single artifact. Objects could be recovered, replaced, or hidden again. Knowledge, once released, could not be so easily contained. That realization forced difficult decisions. We had to consider not only how to expose the network, but how to do so without placing unnecessary targets on our own backs or on the institutions that might support us. It was a balancing act between urgency and responsibility, one that demanded restraint as much as courage. Jasmine took on the task of preparing a comprehensive academic report, meticulously sourced and carefully worded to withstand scrutiny from both scholars and legal experts. Watching her work was a lesson in discipline. She chose language with care, anticipating counterarguments, reinforcing every claim with evidence. This was not just research for her. It was a statement of intent, a refusal to allow truth to be dismissed as opinion. I handled the investigative side, coordinating with trusted contacts and preparing contingencies should the situation escalate. We moved like two halves of the same strategy, each reinforcing the other. Despite our professionalism, the emotional toll became harder to ignore. Late nights blurred into early mornings, and exhaustion stripped away whatever barriers remained between us. In those quiet hours when the city slept and the weight of what we were about to unleash pressed down on us, we talked more openly than ever before. Jasmine admitted that she feared not failure but success, that exposing the truth might isolate her within her field, that being right could come at the cost of belonging. I understood that fear intimately. I had lived with it for decades, choosing solitude over compromise more times than I could count. I shared stories I rarely spoke of, moments when standing by my principles had cost me relationships and opportunities. I told her how I had learned to accept that loneliness often accompanied integrity, and how that acceptance had shaped me in ways I was still unpacking. She listened with an intensity that made me feel seen rather than judged, and in return, she spoke about her longing for connection that didn't require constant justification. In those exchanges, our bond deepened, grounded not in illusion or escape, but in shared understanding. As the final pieces fell into place, the reality of what we were about to do became unavoidable. We were preparing to challenge individuals and systems with resources far beyond our own. The risk was real and the outcome uncertain, yet neither of us suggested stopping. The decision had already been made, quietly and irrevocably, the moment we chose to value truth over comfort. That choice carried weight, but it also brought clarity. There was no longer room for hesitation. The night before we planned to release our findings to the appropriate authorities and academic channels, we sat together in my apartment, the evidence organized and ready. The atmosphere was calm in a way that surprised me, as though the storm had already passed and left behind a clear, cold sky. Jasmine looked around the room thoughtfully, then at me, her expression steady. She thanked me not just for my work, but for standing beside her when it would have been easier to step away. The gratitude in her voice was quiet, but it carried depth. I responded honestly, telling her that this partnership had reminded me why I had chosen this path in the first place. Not for recognition or reward, but for moments like this, when doing the right thing mattered more than the cost. As we sat there, the silence between us felt full rather than empty, shaped by trust and shared resolve. Whatever happened next, I knew we would face it with the same clarity that had brought us this far. That night, as the city lights dimmed and the world outside remained unaware of the truths waiting to surface, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. The weight of truth was heavy, but it was also grounding. It anchored us to something larger than fear, larger than consequence. And in that certainty, I understood that no matter how the story ended, choosing integrity had already changed us both. The lesson that lasted forever. The morning we released the findings arrived without ceremony, which felt strangely appropriate given everything that had led to it. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public spectacle waiting outside my building, no sudden sense of triumph. Instead, there was quiet resolve. The kind that settles into your bones when a decision has already been made and all that remains is to carry it through. Jasmine arrived early, carrying herself with the same composed determination I had come to recognize as her anchor. She didn't speak much at first. Neither did I. Words felt unnecessary when the truth had already been assembled, verified, and prepared to stand on its own. We divided the final steps carefully. The investigative files went to law enforcement contacts I trusted, individuals with the authority and integrity to pursue the matter without burying it. Jasmine's academic report was submitted simultaneously to multiple institutions and independent review boards, ensuring that no single gatekeeper could quietly suppress it. The strategy was intentional. Transparency through distribution, truth through exposure. Once released, the information would belong to the public record, immune to quiet disappearance. As the hours passed, responses began to arrive. Measured at first cautious, then increasingly direct. Requests for clarification, confirmations of receipt, indications that the material was being taken seriously. There was no immediate resolution, no neat conclusion wrapped in official statements. Instead, there was momentum, slow but unmistakable. The kind that suggested this would not be forgotten or easily undone. What surprised me most was not the external reaction, but the internal shift that followed. For weeks, my focus had been fixed on strategy, protection, and outcome. When the pressure finally eased, even slightly, I felt the full weight of what we had carried. Jasmine felt it too. That afternoon, after the last file had been sent and the final call made, we sat together in silence, the room filled with an unfamiliar stillness. It wasn't relief exactly, it was recognition. She was the first to speak, her voice thoughtful rather than celebratory. She said that throughout her career she had believed knowledge alone was enough, that truth would naturally rise if it were well documented and carefully argued. This experience had taught her otherwise. Truth, she realized, also required courage, timing, and the willingness to stand beside others when the cost became personal. The lesson wasn't disillusioning, it was clarifying. I told her that for me, the lesson ran in the opposite direction. I had spent years believing distance was the price of professionalism, that caring too deeply compromised judgment. Working with her had challenged that assumption. I had seen how commitment could sharpen focus rather than dull it, how shared purpose could strengthen resolve rather than weaken it. For the first time in a long while, I understood that connection did not have to be a liability. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded steadily. Investigations expanded. Institutions issued cautious but meaningful statements. Scholars reached out to Jasmine, some in gratitude, others in quiet acknowledgement that the work mattered. Not everyone was supportive, and we had expected that. Resistance came in subtle forms, skepticism, delay, strategic silence, but it no longer held the same power. The story was out, and it could not be returned to the shadows. Jasmine faced changes in her professional life, some challenging, others unexpectedly affirming. Opportunities shifted. New collaborations emerged. The path ahead was different from the one she had imagined, but it was no less purposeful. She navigated it with grace, grounded by a clearer understanding of who she was and what she was willing to stand for. Watching her step into that clarity was one of the quiet privileges of my life. As for me, I found myself reassessing more than just my career. The case closed eventually, as all cases do, but it left something open in its wake. A willingness to remain engaged rather than guarded. A recognition that the chapters we assume are behind us may still have something to teach. I didn't reinvent myself or abandon the life I had built. I simply allowed it to expand. Our connection settled into something steady and unforced, shaped by mutual respect and shared experience rather than urgency. There was no need to define it loudly or rush it into categories. It existed comfortably in the space we had earned, grounded in trust and understanding. We continued to talk, to challenge each other, to learn. And in that continuity, I found a sense of fulfillment that felt both unexpected and deeply right. Looking back, I understand now that the most important lesson of this journey was not about stolen artifacts or hidden networks. It was about presence, about choosing to remain open to meaning, even when experience has taught you caution. Jasmine came into my life as a consultant, an expert brought in to help solve a problem. What she offered, without ever intending to teach it, was a reminder that growth does not have an expiration date, and that some lessons arrive quietly, changing us not th.